Hi, and welcome back to another video. In today's tutorial, we're going to take a look at how to weather this BNSF-9. Out of the box, these ScaleTrains locomotives already look incredible, but with just a little bit of weathering, we'll make them look like something you'd see out on the real railroad. And specifically in today's video, I want to focus on techniques and things you can do to weather locomotives that don't require an airbrush. So this is a project you can do for $30 or $35 in paint supplies and right at home at your kitchen table or desk. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin any weathering, we'll take just a minute or two to remove some details on the locomotive. That's going to keep them from getting damaged, but also give us access to a lot of the surfaces on the sides of the locomotive. So using a dull X-Acto blade and just a little bit of pressure, we'll remove the side handrails as well as the side and front windows on the cab of the locomotive. This is going to keep them protected, and specifically for the windows, for this technique, I think it's important to remove them instead of simply masking them over. And I'll show you why in a few minutes. Once I remove one window, I can take the dull end of a paintbrush and simply press out the other windows once I have access to the inside of the cab. We'll set them in a jar that will be used later once we reassemble the locomotive. Also, I want to remove the coupler pockets. This is going to allow us to take the shell off of the frame so we can weather the two separately and individually. It's just going to keep paint in the right area and keep us from accidentally painting the wrong parts if everything's so close together. You'll see why this is an important step in just a few minutes. So with the handrails, windows, and couplers removed, we'll remove the shell from the frame and begin weathering. We'll begin the weathering by fading down some of the colors here on the shell. We'll start with the orange, work our way to the green, and then finish with the yellow stripes. And if you'll notice, most prototype locomotives are faded after years out in the sun, so that's something we're going to recreate here. I've mixed some acrylic paint, which I'll link in the description below. I've mixed a little bit of orange and a little bit of white to go ahead and create a light orange color that matches the prototype pictures. And I added a few drops of water as well, just to thin it down a touch. However, if you thin it down too much, you'll notice that it starts to streak, and something you really don't want. So with just a couple drops, I've noticed it seems to be about the perfect consistency, and we get you a nice smooth and even fade. Once you have the right color and consistency, it's really just painting in the lines, kind of like a coloring book, so to speak. And I'll show you here how I mix the color for the green specifically. I'll use a little bit of bright green, some dark green, and then I'll go back in and add a little bit of green later to match the prototype pictures that I'm using for references to weather this locomotive. All of these paints are some of the cheapest ones I could find on Amazon. You can pick them up on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description below, or at your local arts and crafts store. And I want to do this just to show you can get great results while not having to spend a lot of money on expensive products. Again, it's just painting within the lines, and if you overpaint or go over areas that you don't want, the great part about this is that it's acrylic paint, so with just a little bit of water on a paper towel or a napkin, you're able to remove it very easily. Or for me, I found a little Phillips head screwdriver. If I paint just a little too far over a line, is great to go back and scrape some of that off. With the sides of the locomotive done, I'm going to add just a little bit of extra white to my paint to create a more faded look, since this area of the locomotive is hit hardest by the sun, and come back and finish the top. I'll actually add a white stripe there to the long hood roof of the locomotive and then blend that into the green. This just kind of represents prototype pictures that I've seen of the roofs of these locomotives. Lastly, for the fading, we'll come back and finish the yellow stripe. This is done very similarly to the orange and to the green. I'll add just a little bit of white to the bright yellow paint that I purchased and is in the set, which I've included in the link below. Once I get the right color, I'm just going to go back and use a very fine brush to paint within the lines and to kind of go over that yellow stripe to give it a nice faded look that matches the prototype. It's incredibly hard to match the perfectly straight lines from the factory on these small stripes, so just like before, I'll come back with the Phillips head screwdriver and scrape off some of the paint. And if you're wondering why the screwdriver, it's because it's a very dull surface, but it's hard enough to remove the paint, but it's not sharp enough where I'm actually going to damage or scrape off any of the underlying factory paint. So it's just a simple tool in my workbench that seemed to work well for the job. Once we finished painting the shell, I'm going to give it a dull coat. For that, I use Krylon Matte Finish. The product number is 1311 or 1311. I'll just head outside, give it a quick spray, let that dry. We'll come back and do the next step. We'll begin adding some dirt and grime to the long hood and surfaces of the locomotive. To do this, we're going to use some AIM weathering powder, although any black weathering powder for models will work. What I do is kind of effectively create a wash while using weathering powders. I will cover the entire side of the locomotive and then use a damp paper towel to go ahead and scrape it off and remove it. When I do that, I make sure that I do it in a vertical fashion, so I'm scraping top to bottom to kind of represent the way that the water would wash that dirt and grime into the surface and cracks of the locomotive. You can see here as we wipe it off with that damp paper towel, I'll follow it up with a dried paper towel, and that'll kind of scrape it off of the main surfaces while leaving a lot of that weathering powder in the small crevices and cracks of the locomotive. It not only makes it look more realistic from a weathering standpoint, but also highlights some of the details on the shell. Next, we're going to recreate some of the tread paint and grip surfaces that you'll find on the roof and on the nose of the cab. For this, we're going to go ahead and begin by masking off the area that you'll find on the prototype locomotives, which is a small patch along the front center of the long hood roof. After that, we'll mix our paint color. For that, we'll use a little bit of black, white, and a couple different shades of brown. Using a damp paintbrush, we'll apply these to the model and mix them together to go ahead and create a nice blended effect that will recreate some of the effects that you'll find on the prototype locomotive. And while I'm going to show you how I do it to the roof, I'm going to recreate those exact same techniques on the nose of the locomotive, which you'll see in the final product. So I'll begin by applying the colors individually, one on top of another, and then lastly I'll come back with a damp paintbrush and mix them together. For some reason, the grip paint that the railroads use weathers a little bit of a different fashion than the standard paint on the sides and the rest of the roof of the locomotive, and that means it weathers differently too. So you'll see it's a little bit of a lighter color, and sometimes it's a mix of different colors that we'll recreate here. We'll let that dry and then remove the masking tape and seal it in with a final clear coat. With the roof of the locomotive and upper shell done, we'll move on to weathering the underframe. For this, we're going to use a mix of brown, black, and white as I've shown you below. And we'll add some rust to the sill, and then we'll move on to weathering the trucks. Like before, when weathering and modeling rust, layers is kind of the name of the game. We'll begin with a light gray color, come back with some darker brown, and then fill in the centers of that with some light brown and mix them together to add and recreate a realistic looking rust. Lastly, to finish up the weathering and modernize the locomotive, we're going to apply some yellow safety striping. This matches the prototype locomotives, and for the model, we're going to be using a product made by Smokebox Graphics. They're pre-cut with a laser, and they're very fine with adhesive backing, so all you have to do is find a prototype photo for reference and apply them to the sill of the locomotive. With the shell complete, we'll give it one final clear coat, set that aside, and move on to the underframe. For this, we're going to use a thinned brown paint to cover the frame and the trucks, and meanwhile we're going to spare the fuel tank. For some reason, on some of the older BNSF locomotives, the fuel tank isn't quite as heavily weathered as the rest of the locomotive. We'll let that dry, and then we'll come back with a wash. This is a Tamiya panel accent liner. However, it actually works really well for covering broad surfaces as well. So using the applicator that comes with the bottle, we're going to cover the entire surface of the underframe, and again, that's after the brown paint has initially dried. I found that this works incredibly well on the underframe, but for some reason, when you coat the entire surface of the shell and upper half of the locomotive, it doesn't look quite as good. I think that's because the underframe gets a little bit more dirt, grime, and dust from being out on the road. that completes our weathering job. We will let everything dry and then come back and add one last clear coat to the underframe. After that, we'll reinstall all of the details, and this is a great time to add just a little bit of extra window tint to the sides of the locomotive windows. I will tape them face down to a piece of blue tape, and using an extra thick and extra strong Sharpie, which I'll link below, I'll go ahead and add just a little extra coat of tint to the back of the windows. This is a great way to recreate the prototype and reinstall them. After that, our locomotive is done. With the windows tinted, we'll reinstall them onto the model with the rest of the details. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to weather a ScaleTrains BNSF-9. You can check out the link in the description for some of the materials and products that I used in this video. And if you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.